Dorothy Mae Whitfield stood in the jasmine-scented backyard of her son's Charleston home, her hand frozen on the wrought iron gate as words drifted through the open kitchen window that would change everything. "Honestly, Robert, why is she even still alive?" The voice belonged to her daughter-in-law, Vanessa, and it cut through the humid Carolina air like a blade through silk. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat, her 78-year-old heart hammering against her ribs. "This can't be our Eel, not my family, not the people I've sacrificed everything for." She had arrived early for Sunday dinner, as she always did, bringing her famous she-crab soup in a covered pot, expecting hugs and laughter. Instead, she found herself pressed against the brick wall of the garden shed, hidden by the sprawling magnolia tree, listening to her own family dissect her existence like vultures circling prey. The conversation continued, each word a fresh wound. Vanessa complained about the weekly visits, the space Dorothy took up in their lives, the inconvenience of her presence. Robert, her own flesh and blood, the boy she'd worked 3 jobs to put through college after his father died, responded with weak protests that dissolved into agreement. "She does expect a lot of attention," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the clinking of glasses. "And with the inheritance eventually coming our way, maybe we could. I don't know. Suggest she'd be happier somewhere else?" Dorothy felt her knees weaken, but she remained standing, every survival instinct she'd honed through decades of single motherhood, telling her to stay silent, to gather information, to understand the full scope of this betrayal before acting. "They want me gone. They want me dead. But they want my money alive." This was the moment that separates those who collapse under cruelty from those who transform it into power. What Dorothy didn't know, as she stood trembling in that fragrant southern garden, was that this devastating discovery would become her liberation. By the end of this story, you'll witness how one woman turned the pain of family betrayal into a masterclass in dignity, boundaries, and the courage to rewrite your legacy when those closest to you reveal their true nature. You'll see how silence can be more powerful than confrontation, how patience can sharpen revenge into justice, and how the greatest inheritance we can leave isn't money, but the lesson that respect is non-negotiable. This isn't just Dorothy's story. It's a mirror held up to every family that mistakes kindness for weakness, generosity for obligation, and presence for burden. The question isn't whether Dorothy will survive this moment. The question is, what happens when the person everyone underestimated decides to stop playing by their rules? Dorothy remained hidden in the garden for another 20 minutes, her body pressed against the cool brick, listening as Vanessa and Robert continued their assassination of her character. They discussed her outdated opinions, her constant neediness, and how much easier their lives would be once she was finally settled somewhere permanent. Vanessa mentioned a nursing facility she'd researched, one of those places with locked memory care units and medication schedules, as if Dorothy's sharp mind and independent spirit were problems to be managed rather than treasures to be cherished. Robert suggested waiting until after the holidays to broach the subject, so it doesn't seem too cruel. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so soul-crushing. Dorothy memorized every word, every tone, every casual cruelty. She'd learned long ago that knowledge is ammunition, and patience is the hand that loads the gun. When she finally heard them move toward the living room, she silently retreated through the garden gate, leaving the pot of she-crab soup on the back porch steps, like an offering to gods who didn't deserve worship. She drove home through Charleston's historic streets, past the rainbow-colored houses on East Bay, and the church steeples that punctured the twilight sky, seeing none of it. Her hands gripped the steering wheel of her Lincoln Continental so tightly her knuckles turned white. At home in the antebellum house on Trad Street that she'd maintained immaculately for 5 decades, she sat in her late husband's study surrounded by his law books and her own carefully organized financial records. They think I'm a fool. They think I'm weak. They think I'm already dead. But Dorothy Mae Whitfield had survived the death of her husband at 35, raised a son alone while managing rental properties and investments, and built a portfolio worth over $3 million through discipline and intelligence. She wasn't weak. She'd just been too generous to notice she was being devoured. The next morning, Dorothy did something she'd never done before. She called her attorney, Marcus Henderson, a sharp-minded man in his 50s, who'd handled her affairs for 20 years. "Marcus," she said calmly, "I need to review my estate plan, all of it, and I need to understand exactly what options I have regarding changes." He heard something in her voice, that steel beneath silk that old Charleston families recognize instinctively, and he cleared his schedule immediately. Within 2 hours, she sat in his oak-paneled office on Broad Street, documents spread across the conference table like a map of her life's work. The will she'd drafted 5 years ago left everything to Robert: the Trad Street house, the 3 rental properties downtown, the stock portfolio, the antique collection, the land on Edisto Island. Everything. Marcus walked her through alternatives, trusts, charitable foundations, conditional bequests. "You don't have to decide today," he assured her. "No," Dorothy replied, her voice quiet but absolute. "But I need to know my options before I make my next move." For the next week, Dorothy played her part perfectly. She called Robert as usual on Wednesday, asking about his work and Vanessa's book club, her voice warm and interested. She declined his invitation to Sunday dinner, claiming a church commitment, detecting the relief in his voice that made her stomach turn. She attended her bridge club, laughed with her friends at the Historical Society meeting, tended her roses with the same care she always had. But at night, in her study, she worked. She reviewed every gift she'd given them over the years: the down payment on their house, the luxury cars, the European vacations, the private school tuition for her grandchildren. She calculated the total with an accountant's precision. Over $400,000 in the past decade alone. Money given with love, accepted with entitlement. She thought about her grandchildren, Emma and Thomas, teenagers now who visited dutifully but spent their time staring at phones, already shaped by their parents' values into polite strangers. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Dorothy received a call from Vanessa, her voice dripping with false sweetness, inviting her to a family meeting on Saturday afternoon. "We have something important to discuss with you, Mother Whitfield. Something we think will be really good for everyone." The euphemism was transparent, the manipulation clumsy. Dorothy agreed pleasantly, marking her calendar with a steady hand. That evening, she called Marcus again. "I've made my decision," she told him. "I want to change everything. I want them to know exactly why, and I want it to be ironclad." They worked through the night, Dorothy dictating her wishes with the clarity of someone who'd crossed an invisible line from hurt to resolution. When she finally signed the new documents, her signature was as firm as it had been on her marriage certificate 53 years ago. "They wanted me silent. They wanted me gone. Now they'll learn what it costs to wish someone dead before their time." But confrontation would come on her terms, in her timing, when the lesson would land with maximum impact. Would you have the strength to face your family's betrayal, or would you pretend you never heard the truth? Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect southern spring weather that mocks private turmoil. Azaleas blooming in violent pinks, the scent of Confederate jasmine heavy in the air, church bells ringing across the peninsula. Dorothy dressed carefully in a coral silk blouse and cream linen pants, her silver hair styled in the elegant waves she'd worn for decades, her mother's pearl earrings catching the light. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not an old woman waiting to be discarded, but a warrior preparing for battle. They think they're about to solve a problem. They have no idea they're walking into a reckoning. She drove to Robert's house in Mount Pleasant, crossing the Ravenel Bridge with the Cooper River sparkling below, and parked in the circular driveway behind Vanessa's Mercedes and Robert's BMW, cars she'd helped them purchase. The scene was staged with insulting transparency. Robert and Vanessa sat together on the sofa in their pristine living room, decorated in that aggressively neutral style that suggested wealth without warmth. Emma and Thomas were conspicuously absent, likely banished upstairs so the adults could handle things. Coffee had been prepared, cookies arranged on a plate nobody would touch, the performance of hospitality without its substance. "Mom, thank you for coming," Robert began, his discomfort obvious in the way he couldn't meet her eyes. Vanessa placed a hand on his knee, steering him like a ventriloquist with a puppet. "Mother Whitfield, we've been thinking a lot about your well-being," she continued, her voice that particular pitch of concern that privileged people use when they're about to do something cruel and want to feel good about it. "You're not getting any younger, And this big house on Trad Street, all those stairs, the maintenance. We worry about you." Dorothy sat in the wingback chair across from them, her posture impeccable, her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing. The silence stretched, growing heavier, until Vanessa felt compelled to fill it. We've looked into some wonderful senior living communities, places with activities, medical staff on site, where you wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or being alone. There's one called Magnolia Gardens that's absolutely beautiful, right near here, so we could visit regularly. The lie was delivered with such smooth conviction that Dorothy almost admired it. Robert finally spoke, his voice pleading for understanding. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. You've worked so hard your whole life. Don't you think it's time to let someone else take care of things? We could sell the Trad Street house, use that money to secure your spot at Magnolia Gardens, and you'd be set for life. No more worries." Translation, Dorothy thought coldly. "We want your house, we want you contained, and we want to start enjoying our inheritance while you're still breathing." She let them finish their entire pitch, watching them grow more uncomfortable with her stillness before she finally spoke. "I overheard you," she said simply, her voice calm as a pond before a storm. 2 weeks ago, I came early for Sunday dinner and I stood in your backyard. I heard everything you said. Every word about why I'm still alive, about being a burden, about how much easier your lives would be without me." The color drained from Robert's face. Vanessa's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flash of panic in her eyes. "Mom, Robert started, but Dorothy raised one elegant hand, silencing him. "I heard my son agree that I expect too much attention. I heard my daughter-in-law research nursing homes as if I'm incompetent. I heard you both discuss my death as if it were an inconvenience that's taking too long to arrive." Her voice never rose above conversational volume, which somehow made it more devastating than shouting would have been. "For 50 years, Dorothy continued, I have given everything to this family. I worked 3 jobs after your father died, Robert, so you could go to college. I helped you buy this house. I paid for your children's education. I showed up for every birthday, every holiday, every moment you allowed me to be part of your lives. And you responded by wishing I was dead." The word hung in the air like smoke. Vanessa tried to speak, her voice shaking. "You misunderstood. We would never." But Dorothy was done with lies. "I didn't misunderstand anything. I understood perfectly. You wanted me gone, but you wanted my money to stay. You wanted the inheritance without the inconvenience of the person who earned it." She stood then, her full 5'4" frame somehow filling the room with presence. "So I'm going to give you exactly what you wanted. No more burden. No more inconvenience. No more expectations." She walked toward the door, her steps measured, and delivered her final blow without looking back. And no more inheritance. The truth was out. The masks were off. But the real consequences were only beginning. What would you do if your family's love turned out to be conditional on your silence and your money? The drive home from Mount Pleasant blurred past Dorothy like a dream, adrenaline and grief mixing into something that felt almost like liberation. Her hands only started shaking when she pulled into her driveway on Trad Street, the historic house that had been her sanctuary suddenly feeling like a fortress she'd have to defend. Inside, she poured herself 2 fingers of her late husband's bourbon, something she never did in daylight, and sat in his study with the new estate documents Marcus had prepared. The changes were comprehensive and irreversible. The house would go to the Charleston Historical Society upon her death. The rental properties would fund a scholarship for single mothers at the College of Charleston. The stock portfolio would be divided among 3 charities she'd supported for decades: the Food Bank, the Literacy Council, and the Animal Shelter. Robert received exactly what the law required: nothing, because South Carolina didn't mandate inheritance for adult children. Vanessa, of course, received even less. Within an hour of Dorothy's departure, her phone began ringing. First Robert, his voice cracking with tears she suspected were more about money than genuine remorse. She let it go to voicemail. Then Vanessa, surprisingly, trying a different tactic: aggressive indignation. "How dare you accuse us of such horrible things? We were only trying to help. You're clearly not thinking rationally." Dorothy deleted the message without finishing it. Then Emma, her granddaughter, clearly coached. "Grandma, I don't understand what's happening, but Dad is really upset and Mom is crying. That one hurt, the weaponizing of her grandchildren's voices. But Dorothy had learned something crucial in 78 years. People who use children as shields aren't protecting anyone but themselves. She texted Emma back, "I love you. This is between me and your parents. Why you're always welcome in my life if you choose to be." The distinction mattered. She was closing doors to those who'd betrayed her, but leaving windows open for those who might eventually understand. The Charleston Gossip Network, that invisible web that connects church pews and garden clubs and junior league meetings, activated within days. Dorothy's friends began calling, delicately probing for information without seeming to pry, a social skill refined over generations in the Holy City. Garrett Rutledge, her bridge partner for 20 years, was most direct. "I saw Vanessa at the Harris Teeter, and she looked like she'd been hit by a truck. And I haven't seen you at your usual Sunday pew with Robert's family. What's happened?" Dorothy decided she was done protecting other people's reputations at the expense of her own truth. Over tea in her garden, surrounded by the roses she'd pruned and fed and coaxed into blooming, she told Garrett everything. The eavesdropped conversation, the nursing home ambush, the years of taking her presence for granted while spending her money like water. Margaret listened with the stillness of a woman who'd seen her share of family betrayals behind Charleston's prettiest facades, then said something Dorothy would remember forever. "Money reveals character. It doesn't create it. Those children showed you who they were when they thought you couldn't hear them. Believe them." She paused, sipping her sweet tea. "And good for you for not playing dead while you're still breathing." The validation felt like oxygen after drowning. Dorothy had been raised in an era where women, especially Southern women, were expected to absorb disrespect with grace, to keep family secrets, to enable dysfunction in the name of loyalty. But she was done with that particular form of self-destruction. She began accepting lunch invitations she'd previously declined, attending gallery openings and symphony performances, filling her calendar with people who actually wanted her company rather than her eventual death. The subplot Dorothy hadn't anticipated emerged a month later, her grandchildren's response. Thomas, 17 and college-bound, showed up at her door one afternoon without announcement, his face flushed with the awkwardness of adolescence and something deeper, more painful. "Grandma," he said, standing on her piazza, "I need to know if what Dad said is true. That you're cutting us of F because we didn't visit enough." Dorothy invited him in, poured him lemonade, and told him the unvarnished truth. Not a performance, not a manipulation, just the facts. What she'd heard, what had been said, what she'd decided. Thomas listened, his jaw tightening, and when she finished, he said something that broke her heart in a different way. "I'm not surprised. Mom talks about money constantly, and Dad always does whatever she says." He looked at his grandmother with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than 17. "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was that bad." But he had known. Dorothy realized. Children always know when their parents are performing love instead of living it. The question was whether knowing would be enough to change anything, or if patterns set in childhood were already too deep to break. Summer arrived in Charleston with its customary vengeance. Temperatures climbing into the 90s, humidity thick enough to swim through, thunderstorms that rolled in from the Atlantic with biblical fury. Dorothy found she didn't mind the heat the way she used to. She was too busy rediscovering what it meant to live for herself instead of in orbit around her son's approval. She joined a book club that actually read challenging literature instead of celebrity memoirs. She started volunteering twice a week at the Low Country Food Bank, sorting donations alongside other retirees who'd also discovered that purpose doesn't retire just because you do. She even took a watercolor class at the Gibbs Museum, something she'd wanted to do for decades but had never found time for, which was just another way of saying she'd never prioritized her own desires over everyone else's needs. Robert's attempts at reconciliation came in waves, each more desperate than the last. First, the apology texts, vague acknowledgments of misunderstandings that carefully avoided admitting actual wrongdoing. When Dorothy didn't respond, he graduated to letters, handwritten pages that started with, "I've been doing a lot of thinking," and ended with, "You're my mother and I love you," as if love were a magic word that erased betrayal rather than a commitment demonstrated through consistent action. Vanessa, to her credit, didn't pretend. She sent one email, brief and acidic, I hope you're happy destroying your family over a conversation you weren't supposed to hear. The lack of self-awareness was almost impressive. Dorothy saved that email in a folder labeled evidence. Though evidence of what? She wasn't entirely sure. Evidence that she'd made the right decision, perhaps. Evidence that some people apologize only when they lose access to your resources, not because they've experienced genuine change. The real test came when Emma called, not coach this time, but genuinely distraught, asking if she could visit. Dorothy said yes, and her granddaughter arrived on a Saturday afternoon with swollen eyes and the kind of exhaustion that comes from living in a house where everyone's pretending everything is fine when it manifestly isn't. They fight constantly now, Emma confessed, curled up on Dorothy's porch swing with a glass of iced tea sweating onto a coaster. Dad blames Mom for what she said. Mom blames Dad for not defending her. They both blame you for overreacting. But Grandma, she paused, struggling with words. I heard what Mom said too. Once. About you being old-fashioned and difficult. I didn't think it was that big a deal at the time, but now I can't stop thinking about how mean it actually was. Dorothy felt something crack open in her chest, a sliver of hope that maybe the next generation wasn't entirely lost. Emma, Dorothy said carefully, I need you to understand something. I didn't cut your parents of F because they had one bad conversation. I cut them of F because that conversation revealed a pattern I'd been ignoring for years. They valued my money more than my presence, and they saw my eventual death as a solution to their inconvenience rather than a loss they'd mourn. She reached over and took her granddaughter's hand, finding it cold despite the heat. I changed my will not to punish them, but to protect myself. To draw a line between what I'll accept and what I won't. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and it might be the healthiest. Emma nodded, crying quietly, and said something Dorothy hadn't expected. Can I still visit you, even if they're mad about it? The question hung between them, like a bridge only Emma could choose to cross. Always, Dorothy answered. My door is open to anyone who genuinely wants to be here. That's never changed. The subplot of Dorothy's social renaissance gained momentum through an unexpected source. Marcus Henderson, her attorney, who mentioned at a follow-up meeting that his mother, Loretta, was also widowed and looking for bridge partners. She's formidable, Marcus warned with an affectionate smile. Former federal judge, doesn't suffer fools. You two would either become best friends or declare war within 5 minutes. Dorothy laughed for the first time in weeks and agreed to coffee. Loretta Henderson turned out to be a force of nature. 81 years old, sharp as a scalpel, with opinions on everything from Supreme Court decisions to the best she-crab soup in Charleston. Hyman's, according to her, though Dorothy loyally defended Fleet Landing. They bonded over shared experiences of outliving their husbands, managing assets in a world that still underestimated older women, and the particular loneliness of being widowed in a city designed for couples and families. The secret, Loretta told her over lunch at 167 Raw, is to build a life so full that other people's presence is a bonus, not a necessity. Makes you less vulnerable to manipulation. It was advice Dorothy wished she'd internalized decades earlier. But better late than never. She was building something new from the ruins of betrayal. Not a RE placement family, but a chosen community of people who saw her as more E than a bank account with a heartbeat. But would Robert ever understand what he'd lost? Or would greed keep him blind until it was too late to repair anything? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get back to it. Fall in Charleston is its own kind of magic. When the oppressive heat finally breaks and the city exhales. When you can walk the Battery without feeling like you're melting. When the oyster roasts start and the air smells like salt and wood smoke. Dorothy marked the 6-month anniversary of her life's upheaval by hosting a dinner party. Something she hadn't done since before her husband died, when entertaining felt like a burden added to her grief. She invited Loretta and Marcus, Margaret Rutledge and her husband James, and 2 women from her book club who'd become genuine friends. She cooked her grandmother's recipes: okra soup, shrimp and grits, Benny seed wafers, pecan pie. The conversation flowed like good wine, laughter filling the rooms of her Trad Street house in a way they hadn't been filled in years. At one point, Loretta raised her glass and said, T.O. Dorothy, who chose herself. And everyone drank to that, and Dorothy felt something she'd almost forgotten. Contentment that didn't depend on anyone's approval but her own. The lawsuit arrived the first week of October, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about the whole thing. Robert and Vanessa were challenging the new will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity, claiming Dorothy wasn't of sound mind when she made the changes, that Marcus Henderson had manipulated a vulnerable widow. The accusations were both predictable and infuriating. Marcus, when she called him immediately, was completely unfazed. "We expected this," he said calmly. "Which is why I had you undergo a cognitive assessment with Dr. Patricia Morrison before we finalized anything. She's one of the most respected neuropsychologists in the Southeast. Her evaluation shows you're sharper than most people half your age. This lawsuit will go nowhere, but it'll be expensive and ugly." Dorothy heard the question beneath his statement. "Do it," she said. "I'm not backing down. If they want to publicly claim I'm incompetent, let them try. The truth has a way of surfacing." The next 2 months were a masterclass in the gap between legal theater and actual justice. Robert and Vanessa hired Franklin Pierce, a lawyer known more for his connections to old Charleston money than his actual competence, who filed motion after motion claiming Dorothy had been confused and emotionally unstable when she changed her will. They submitted evidence that consisted mostly of normal signs of aging. She'd forgotten a lunch date once. She sometimes repeated stories. She'd gotten lost driving to a new restaurant in West Ashley. Marcus systematically demolished each claim. He presented Dr. Morrison's detailed cognitive assessment showing Dorothy scoring in the 95th percentile for her age group. He submitted testimony from Dorothy's Bridge Club about her sharp memory and strategic thinking. He even included A.F. Fidovitz from her financial advisor and her primary care physician, attesting to her mental acuity and independent decision-making. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Constance Williams, grew visibly annoyed with the proceedings. The turning point came during Dorothy's deposition, when she had to sit across a conference table from Robert and Vanessa and answer Franklin Pierce's condescending questions designed to make her seem confused or vindictive. "Mrs. Whitfield," he asked with exaggerated patience, "isn't it true that you made these drastic changes to your estate plan in a moment of emotional distress, after what you claim was a misunderstanding?" Dorothy looked him directly in the eye and responded with a clarity that made the court reporter smile despite herself. "No, I made these changes after discovering, through their own words, that my son and daughter-in-law saw me as a burden they were waiting to inherit from. I made them after realizing I'd spent decades funding a relationship that was transactional rather than genuine. I made them because I'm old, Mr. Pierce, not stupid. And I refused to spend my remaining years pretending I didn't hear what I clearly heard." She turned to Robert then, finding him unable to meet her gaze. "I wanted to believe I'd raised a better man than the one who agreed I was expecting too much attention. I was wrong, but I'm not wrong about protecting myself now." The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice 3 days before Thanksgiving. Judge Williams's written opinion included a paragraph that Marcus later framed for his advice. The court finds no evidence of diminished capacity on the part of Mrs. Whitfield, but rather clear evidence of a woman exercising sound judgment in the face of family members whose sense of entitlement exceeds their sense of decency. A person's right to dispose of their property as they see fit is fundamental, and the plaintiff FS attempt to manipulate the legal system because they disliked the testator's decisions is both frivolous and disturbing. The legal fees cost Robert and Vanessa over $60,000. Money Dorothy knew they didn't really have and had probably borrowed against their expectation of her eventual estate. She felt a brief flash of satisfaction, followed by a deeper sadness. She'd won the legal battle, but the war had casualties that couldn't be repaired. A son who chose GRE'd over R relationship, grandchildren and caught in CR ossphere E they didn't care eat, and the permanent end of the family she'd once imagined GR owing old Sir ounded by. But as Loretta reminded her over celebratory champagne, some families are born and some are chosen. You're finally free to choose. Was freedom worth this price, or would she spend her remaining years wondering if she could have handled it differently? The holidays arrived like an unwelcome guest Dorothy had to accommodate anyway. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been her domain. The elaborate meals, the decorated house, the traditions maintained despite exhaustion. This year, for the first time in 5 decades, she accepted an invitation instead of issuing one. Loretta's family welcomed her into their boisterous, multi-generational gathering with the kind of warmth that comes from people secure enough not to perform it. They argued about politics, laughed too loud, let the children run wild, and treated Dorothy like she'd always been there. It was chaotic and imperfect and real, in a way her own carefully controlled family dinners had never been. She helped Loretta's daughter-in-law, Simone, in the kitchen and learned she was a marine biologist studying dolphin populations in Charleston Harbor. "You should come out on the boat sometime," Simone affirmed casually. "We always need volunteers for data collection." Dorothy Churchier, who hadn't been on a boat since her husband died, said yes before she could overthink it. Christmas proved harder. Emma and Thomas both texted, asking if they could visit, and Dorothy said yes with a caveat. "You're welcome here anytime. Your parents are not." Emma came on Christmas Eve, bringing gifts and guilt in equal measure. She'd been accepted to the College of Charleston with a partial scholarship, but was struggling to figure out how to pay the rest. "Dad says he can't help much," she admitted, the shame evident in her voice. "They're pretty broke after the lawyer fees." Dorothy felt the familiar pull of maternal obligation, the instinct to solve problems that weren't really hers to solve, and had to consciously resist it. "Emma," she said gently but firmly, "I have established a scholarship fund for students at the College of Charleston. You're eligible to apply like anyone else, but I will not give money directly to your parents to be managed, and I will not fund your education in a way that relieves them of the responsibility they took on when they became parents." It was harsh but necessary. Emma cried, but she also nodded understanding. "I get it," she whispered. "I do. It's just really hard." Thomas didn't visit, but he called on Christmas morning with news that hit Dorothy like a physical blow. He'd enlisted in the Marines and would be leaving for boot camp at Paris Island in January. "I need to get out of that house," he told her bluntly. "I can't watch them destroy themselves over money anymore, and I need to know I can make it on my own without anyone's inheritance or help." Dorothy heard the echo of her own younger self in his words, that desperate need to prove independence in the face of family dysfunction. "I'm proud of you," she told him, meaning it, even as her heart broke imagining him in combat. "And when you get leave time, my door is always open." After they hung up, she sat in her living room surrounded by the modest decorations she'd put up for herself, feeling the full weight of what she'd lost and gained. She'd traded the illusion of family harmony for the reality of honest relationships. It was the right choice. It still hurt. The new year brought unexpected developments. The Charleston Post and Courier published a human interest story about Dorothy's scholarship fund for single mothers, complete with an interview where she spoke carefully about the importance of supporting women rebuilding their lives. She didn't mention Robert or the will, but anyone who knew the family could read between the lines. The responses were overwhelming. Thank you notes from scholarship recipients, donations from strangers who'd been moved by her story, and most surprisingly, a call from the College of Charleston asking if she'd be willing to serve on the advisory board for their women's leadership program. Dorothy, who'd spent most of her life believing her value came from serving her family, discovered she had skills and perspectives the wider world actually wanted. She said yes to the board position, yes to more volunteer work, yes to the watercolor class she'd been taking, expanding into private lessons with a real artist. She was building a legacy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with impact, the kind of inheritance that couldn't be contested in court or squandered by ungrateful children. The subplot that emerged centered on Vanessa's sister, Patricia, who reached out in February with a stunning confession. They met for coffee at Proof, a quiet bakery on King Street, and Patricia wasted no time getting to the point. "I need to tell you something Vanessa would kill me for saying," she began, her hands wrapped around a latte like she needed its warmth for courage. "She's always been like this. Even as kids, she saw people as resources. She married Robert because he had potential, and because you had money. I heard her say it to our mother. Dorothy's elderly and they have no other kids. We're set for life once she dies." Patricia looked miserable delivering this information. "I should have warned you years ago. I'm so sorry." Dorothy thanked her for the honesty, even as it confirmed her worst suspicions. Some people are taught that love is a transaction, and they spend their whole lives bartering affection for gain. But what happens when the bank account closes and all that's left is the person you neglected to actually know? Would Robert ever realize what he'd traded for money he never got? Or would he spend the rest of his life blaming everyone but himself? Spring returned to Charleston in an explosion of color. Azaleas and wisteria, dogwoods blooming white against the endless green. The whole city waking up from winter's brief sleep. Dorothy celebrated her 79th birthday with a party she threw for herself. 30 guests on her piazza, catered food instead of her cooking, a jazz trio playing in the garden. Robert was not invited. Vanessa was not invited. But Emma came, and Thomas got leave from his Marine training to surprise her, walking in wearing his dress blues and looking so much like his grandfather that Dorothy had to leave the party for 5 minutes to cry in her bathroom. When she returned, Loretta made a toast. Tio, the woman who taught us all that it's never too late to choose yourself, to demand respect, and to build a life worthy of the time we have left. Dorothy felt surrounded by genuine affection, not obligation, and realized this was what she'd been hungry for all along, to be chosen, not endured. The final blow to Robert and Vanessa's finances came in April, when their adjustable rate mortgage reset and their monthly payment jumped by $1,200. Robert called Dorothy for the first time since the lawsuit, his voice raw with desperation. "Mom, we're going to lose the house you helped us buy. Vanessa's not working because she can't find anything that pays enough, and I'm stretched to the limit. We need help. Please, I'm begging you." Dorothy listened to her son beg and felt nothing but a detached kind of sadness. "Robert," she said quietly, "you took me for granted when you thought I'd always be there. You wished I was dead when you thought I couldn't hear you. You sued me when I set boundaries. You have spent years treating me like a burden and an ATM. I will not reward that behavior now that it's finally caught up with you." He tried anger then. "Why, you're my mother. You're supposed to help me." And there it was, the entitlement laid bare. "I am your mother," Dorothy agreed. "Which is why I raised you to be self-sufficient, to work hard, to treat people with respect. If you're failing now, it's not because I withdrew support. It's because you built your life on a foundation of expectation rather than effort." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking not with guilt, but with the realization that she meant every word. Later that week, she heard through Margaret's network that Robert and Vanessa had listed their Mount Pleasant house for sale, planning to downsize to a rental in North Charleston. Their financial collapse was complete, and Dorothy felt no satisfaction in it, only the grim confirmation that people who live beyond their means while waiting for someone else to die usually end up with neither the money nor the relationship. The inheritance they'd counted on was gone. The mother they'd taken for granted was gone too, at least as they'd known her. What remained was a woman who'd discovered her own worth didn't depend on their approval, and that was a lesson they'd never wanted to learn. The unexpected grace note came from an unlikely source. Vanessa herself showed up at Dorothy's door one humid afternoon in May, alone, looking like she'd aged a decade in the past year. "I'm not here to ask for money," she said before Dorothy could speak. "I'm here to apologize. Really apologize, not the fake kind I've been doing." Dorothy almost closed the door, but something in Vanessa's defeated posture stopped her. They sat on the piazza, two women who'd never really known each other despite 2 decades of family dinners, and Vanessa talked. She confessed to growing up poor, to marrying Robert because he seemed stable, to always feeling like she had to perform sophistication she didn't genuinely possess. "I saw you as this wealthy woman who had everything figured out," Vanessa admitted, "and I resented you for it. For having money, for having Robert's love in a way I never quite did, for still being here when I wanted to be the matriarch." It was the most honest thing Vanessa had ever said to her. "That conversation you overheard," Vanessa continued, tears running unchecked down her face. "It was the ugliest version of thoughts I'd been having for years. Thoughts I'm ashamed of. I genuinely don't know if I can change, Dorothy. I don't know if I even know how to love people without calculating what they can do for me. But I wanted you to know that losing everything, the house, the money, the future we'd imagined, has shown me what we actually lost, which was you. And you were worth more than all of it." Dorothy sat with that confession, weighing it against years of subtle cruelties and blatant betrayal. "I appreciate your honesty," she finally said. "I genuinely do. But I can't go back to who I was, pretending I didn't hear what I heard, funding a relationship that was built on you waiting for me to die. I've built a life now that doesn't include people who see me as an obstacle to their inheritance." Vanessa nodded, accepting the boundary, and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. "For what it's worth, Robert is destroyed. He knows he failed you. He's just too proud to say it the way I am." Pride, Dorothy thought, was just another word D for the inability to choose relationship over ego, and she'd spent too many years enabling exactly that in the people she'd loved most. Could a family ever recover from betrayals this deep? Or were some rifts meant to stay broken as evidence of growth rather than failure? Summer arrived again, marking a full year since Dorothy's life had fractured and reformed into something unrecognizable from what came before. She spent her days in a rhythm that felt earned rather than inherited. Mornings in her garden, afternoons volunteering or taking her watercolor lessons, evenings with her chosen community of friends who valued presence over performance. Marcus Henderson joked that she was busier in retirement than most people were in their careers, and he wasn't wrong. The scholarship fund she'd established had grown beyond her initial contribution. Other donors had added to it, inspired by her story, and now 5 single mothers each year received full tuition to the College of Charleston. Emma was one of the first recipients, having applied like everyone else and been selected on merit. They had lunch monthly, building a grandmother-granddaughter relationship finally free from the weight of parental manipulation. Thomas wrote letters from wherever the Marines sent him, places he couldn't name but described through careful detail. Desert heat that made Charleston summers seem mild, friendships for GED through shared hardship, a sense of purpose he'd never found at home. In one letter, he wrote something that Dorothy kept folded in her Bible. "Grandma, you showed me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst self. Dad is miserable, but that misery might be what finally foresees him to look at who he's become. Why you didn't abandon him. Why you just stopped saving him from himself." The wisdom of a 20-year-old Marine, Dorothy thought, often exceeded that of people twice his age who'd never faced real consequences for their choices. She prayed for her son in a way she'd never prayed before. Not for his comfort, but for his transformation, for the painful growth that only comes when every escape route is closed. The Charleston community, in its peculiar way, had taken notice of Dorothy's journey. She was asked to speak at a women's luncheon about redefining family in later life, a topic she'd never imagined having expertise on. Standing before 200 women at the Charleston Place Hotel, Dorothy told her story without shame or self-pity. The overheard conversation, the betrayal, the lawsuit, the reconstruction of a life she thought was already complete. "I thought," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "that my value ended where my usefulness to my family ended. I thought being a good mother meant accepting disrespect with grace, funding dysfunction with generosity, and pretending I didn't see the truth of how little I was actually valued. I was wrong." She paused, looking out at faces reflecting her own journey back at her. "The hardest lesson of my life came at 78 years old. That love without respect is just manipulation with better manners, and that leaving space in your life means some people will choose not to fill it, revealing who they were all along." The response was overwhelming. Women lined up afterward to share their own stories. Adult children who only called when they needed money. Families who saw aging parents as burdens rather than blessings. The particular loneliness of being taken for granted by the people you'd sacrificed most for. Dorothy listened to each one, ferreted what wisdom she'd earned through pain, and realized she'd stumbled into a kind of ministry she'd never planned, bearing witness to the silent epidemic of family betrayal that too many older people suffered in isolation. She exchanged phone numbers, started a small support group that met monthly at her church, and discovered that her experience, while devastating, had given her a purpose deeper than she'd ever known. She'd turned her wound into a lighthouse, guiding others throughout the same dark waters she'd nearly doctor-owned in, and in doing so had found the meaning her earlier life had always lacked. The year anniversary of her transformation arrived on a Sunday in late September. Dorothy woke early, made coffee, and sat on her piazza, watching Charleston wake up. Runners on the Battery, church bells beginning their weekly call, the morning light turning everything golden the way it does in the Low Country when summer finally begins to loosen its grip. She thought about Robert, probably awake too in whatever rental they'd found, maybe thinking about her, maybe not. She thought about the life she'd imagined at this age, surrounded by grateful children and grandchildren, matriarch of a family that valued her, and compared it to the life she'd actually built. Smaller, quieter, but infinitely more genuine. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer defined her. She'd learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between being needed and being valued, between family assigned by biology and family chosen by mutual respect and love. That afternoon, Emma called with news that would test everything Dorothy had rebuilt. "Grandma," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "Dad had a heart attack. He's at MUSC. It's serious. Mom asked me to call you." Dorothy felt her own heart stutter, the primal terror of potentially losing a child regardless of how badly that child had failed her. This was the moment she'd known would come eventually. The crisis that would foresee her to decide if her boundaries were principles or just punishment, if her love was truly unconditional or had always been transactional in ways she'd never admitted. She sat with the question for exactly 3 breaths, then told Emma, "I'm on my way." Because in the end, Dorothy Mae Whitfield was many things. Strong, principled, unwilling to be disrespected. But she was also a mother, and some bonds survive even the worst betrayals, not because they should, but because they're written in DNA and decades of history that can't be erased by a single year of separation. The question was whether Robert's crisis would open a door to genuine reconciliation or just provide another opportunity for manipulation. Would facing mortality finally teach him what losing an inheritance never could? That some things can't be recovered once they're thrown away? And was Dorothy strong enough to hold her boundaries even while holding her son's hand? Or would fear of losing him permanently break what a year of resolve had built? Dorothy stood in the ICU waiting room at the Medical University of South Carolina, the antiseptic smell reminding her of the months she'd spent here decades ago when her husband was dying, and felt the familiar weight of vigil settling on her shoulders. Vanessa sat across from her, looking small and frightened in a way that almost inspired sympathy. Emma and Thomas, who'd gotten emergency leave, flanked their grandmother like guards, a role reversal neither acknowledged but Dorothy quietly appreciated. When the doctor finally emerged to say Robert was stable, that the heart attack had been serious but survivable, that he'd need bypass surgery and significant lifestyle changes, Dorothy felt relief flood through her with such force she had to sit down. She could hold her boundaries and still love her son. These truths weren't contradictory, they were complementary. She visited Robert once he was conscious, found him pale and diminished in the hospital bed, hooked to machines that beeped his continued existence into the sterile air. "Mom," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've been such a fool." Dorothy pulled a chair to his bedside and took his hand, feeling how fragile it was, how mortal, how human. "I know," she said simply, "and sorry isn't enough to erase what happened, Robert, but it's a start." She didn't promise to restore his inheritance. She didn't promise to return to weekly dinners and pretend the past year hadn't happened. She promised to be present for his recovery, to visit when he needed her, to love him despite his failures because that's what mothers do even when their children don't deserve it. But she also made clear, the boundaries stay, the will stays, the life I've built stays. You hurt me deeply, and I will not set myself on fire to keep you warm ever again. Over the months of Robert's recovery, something shifted. Without the expectation of inheritance hanging over every interaction, without Vanessa's constant calculations and manipulations, she'd moved out, filed for separation, finally acknowledging they'd built their marriage on finances rather than foundation. Robert began to actually know his mother. They talked about his childhood, about the years after his father died that he barely remembered, but that had shaped everything Dorothy became. He apologized specifically, naming each wound, taking her for granted, wishing her dead, suing her, treating her presence as a burden while craving her money. The apologies felt real this time, earned through genuine self-reflection rather than performed to manipulate forgiveness. Dorothy accepted them cautiously, building trust slowly, testing whether this transformation was permanent or just another performance. Dorothy Mae Whitfield turned 80 in a celebration that brought together every thread of her reconstructed life. Her chosen family of friends, her scholarship recipients, her support group members, Emma and Thomas, and yes, Robert, still recovering, but present. Looking around her garden filled with people who actually wanted to be there, she felt something she'd chased her whole life and only found by letting go. Peace. Not the peace of having everything work out the way she'd planned, but the deeper peace of knowing she'd survived the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged stronger, clearer, more authentically herself. The inheritance she'd leave wouldn't be money. It would be the example of a woman who chose dignity over family harmony, truth over comfort, and self-respect over the desperate need to be needed. So here's what Dorothy learned and what she affirms to anyone facing similar betrayals. Family is not a shield against cruelty. Sometimes it's the source. Love does not require you to accept disrespect. Changing your will is not revenge, it's setting a boundary. The people who are meant to be in your life will prove it through consistent action, not occasional words. And most importantly, it's never too late to choose yourself, to build a life that reflects your values rather than others' expectations, to transform your pain into purpose. The question Dorothy leaves you with is this: are you funding relationships that drain you because you're afraid of being alone? Or are you brave enough to be alone until you find people who choose you the way you deserve to be chosen? And when your family shows you who they really are, will you believe them? Or will you keep pretending until you're the one they're mourning, having never truly known you at all? Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you or made you think about life in a different way, don't keep it just for yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this too. And if you truly want to support this channel, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading what you have to say. And finally, if you really enjoyed it and want to help keep these stories alive, consider buying me a simple coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest gesture makes a big difference and helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thank you, and see you in the next one.